Bullies mock the quiet student's height. Huge error. She was a capoeira expert. Valentina Restrepo stood barely 5 feet tall in her worn sneakers, her compact frame often lost in the sea of towering teenagers that filled the hallways of Riverside Preparatory Academy. At 17, she had the delicate features of someone who looked younger than her years, with dark eyes that seemed to absorb everything around her while revealing nothing in return. Her thick black hair was always pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she favored oversized hoodies that made her appear even smaller than she already was. The academy buzzed with the energy of privilege and competition, its marble floors echoing with the footsteps of students whose futures seemed predetermined by their family names and bank accounts. Valentina had earned her place here through academic merit, a scholarship student surrounded by wealth she could never touch. This made her different. This made her a target. She moved through the corridors like a shadow, books clutched against her chest, eyes focused straight ahead. The morning routine was always the same. Arrive early, head straight to her locker, gather her materials, and slip into class before the real chaos began. But even her careful timing couldn't always protect her from what was coming. "Look what we have here," came the familiar voice that made Valentina's shoulders tense involuntarily. Marcus Webb, 6'3", and built like the star athlete he was, stepped directly into her path near the main staircase. His perfectly styled blonde hair and designer clothes screamed old money, and his cold blue eyes held the casual cruelty that came with never facing real consequences. Behind him stood his usual crew, Jake Morrison, slightly shorter but broader, with the kind of smirk that suggested he enjoyed others' discomfort, and Ashley Kane, whose beauty was matched only by her vicious tongue. They formed a wall of intimidation that had terrorized weaker students for years. "The little mouse is scurrying again," Ashley said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Valentina, right? God, you're even smaller than I remember. What are you, like 12? Valentina kept her eyes down, attempting to step around them, but Marcus shifted to block her path again. "Hey, I'm talking to you, shorty, don't be rude." The hallway had started to fill with other students, but none made any move to intervene. They formed a loose circle, some pulling out phones, others simply watching with the morbid fascination reserved for car accidents and public humiliation. Mrs. Patterson, who taught freshman English, walked past without even glancing in their direction, her heels clicking efficiently toward her classroom. "Please, I just need to get to class," Valentina said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. She could feel the familiar heat rising in her chest, the muscle memory of movements she'd practiced thousands of times. But she forced herself to remain still. "Not here. Not like this." "Oh," she said, "please." Jake mocked, his voice pitched, high in imitation. "How adorable. Hey, Marcus, I think she might actually be a middle schooler who got lost." Marcus reached out and flicked Valentina's forehead with his finger, the sharp snap echoing in the sudden silence. "You know what? I think you're right. This is a high school, not a daycare. Maybe you should find somewhere more your size." Laughter from the gathered crowd felt like physical blows. Valentina's face burned with humiliation, but she bit her lip hard enough to taste blood and simply nodded, stepping back. "Just walk away. Always just walk away." But Marcus wasn't finished. He grabbed her backpack and lifted it high above his, head well out of her reach. "Jump for it, Tiny. Let's see if you can get some air." "Give it back," Valentina said, still quiet but with a note of steel creeping into her voice that made Jake glance at Marcus uncertainly. "What was that? I couldn't hear you down there." Marcus held the bag even higher, and when Valentina reached for it, he tossed it to Jake, who caught it with exaggerated flair. "Keep away!" Ashley clapped her hands in delight. "This is better than the circus. The amazing jumping bean girl." They tossed her bag back and forth over her head while she stood in the center, hands clenched at her sides, breathing carefully through her nose. Ginga Negativa, Armada. The names of movements flowed through her mind like a mantra, each one a reminder of what she was capable of, what she chose not to do. The bag finally landed hard on the marble floor, spilling her carefully organized notebooks and pens across the hallway. Her physics homework, which had taken her 3 hours the night before, scattered into the path of passing students who stepped on it without thought. "Oops," Marcus said, with theatrical innocence. "Butterfingers." Valentina knelt to gather her belongings, her hands shaking slightly as she tried to smooth out the wrinkled pages. Around her, shoes continued to shuffle past, some deliberately stepping closer to her papers. No one helped. No one ever helped. "This is pathetic," she heard Ashley whisper, loud enough to ensure it carried. "She's not even crying. What kind of freak just takes it like that?" Valentina stood slowly, her salvaged materials clutched against her chest. She looked up at Marcus, and for just a moment something flickered in her dark eyes that made him take an involuntary step backward. But then she simply turned and walked away, leaving behind several papers she couldn't recover. The day continued, with its familiar rhythm of small torments. In the cafeteria, Jake accidentally bumped into her while she carried her lunch tray, sending her sandwich and apple rolling across the floor. She ate a bag of chips for lunch instead, sitting alone at the corner table while laughter erupted from the popular kids section across the room. During gym class, Ashley made sure to comment loudly about how Valentina's gym clothes hung on. Her like she was playing dress-up in her older sister's clothes. The other girls giggled obligingly, and even Coach Martinez seemed to find it amusing rather than concerning. But it was the small moments between the obvious cruelties that wore on her most. The way conversations stopped when she approached, the deliberate shoulder checks in hallways, the way teachers' eyes seemed to slide past her whenever she raised her hand. She had become invisible, except when they wanted to make her feel smaller than she already was. That evening, Valentina sat in her grandmother's small apartment above the Brazilian restaurant they owned, trying to focus on homework, while the sounds of dinner service filtered up through the floorboards. The walls were covered with faded photographs of her grandmother's youth in Salvador, images of a woman who had danced capoeira in the streets when it was still forbidden, who had carried those traditions across an ocean and kept them alive in a new world. Minha netinha, her grandmother Rosa said as she climbed the narrow stairs, her weathered hands carrying a plate of still warm pastéis. You're quiet tonight, more quiet than usual. Valentina looked up from her physics textbook, forcing a smile. Just tired, Vovo, long day. Rosa's eyes, still sharp despite her 78 years, studied her granddaughter's face with the intensity of someone who had survived revolution and immigration and single motherhood. Tired from what? Thinking, or from pretending? I don't know what you mean. You know exactly what I mean. Rosa sat down heavily in the chair across from her, joints creaking in the way that spoke of decades of hard work. You think I don't see? You think I don't recognize the look of someone who's been made to feel small? Valentina's carefully constructed composure cracked slightly. It's not that bad, Vovo. It's just high school. Everyone says it gets better. Better, Rosa snorted, a sound full of derision. Better for who? For the ones who make others. Small so they can feel big. No, minha filha. Better comes when you decide to make it better. They sat in silence for a moment, the sounds of sizzling oil and cheerful conversation drifting up from the restaurant below. Finally, Rosa stood and walked to the old wooden chest in the corner of the room, the one Valentina had been forbidden to touch as a child. She withdrew something wrapped in faded yellow cloth and returned to the table. Your grandfather, Rosa said, unwrapping a pair of worn leather berimbau bows. He played these in the Roda back in Brazil. Before the police, before the persecution stopped, he taught me that capoeira isn't just dance, isn't just fight. It's about being ready, about knowing who you are when the world tries to tell you who you should be. Valentina stared at the instruments, their wood polished smooth by decades of hands and music. Vovo, I can't what? Can't use what I taught you? Can't be what you are? Rosa's voice carried the sharp edge of disappointment. I didn't spend 12 years teaching you to move like water and strike like lightning so you could pretend to be helpless. You don't understand. If I fight back, they'll just make it worse. And if anyone finds out about capoeira, they'll make fun of that too. They'll say it's not real martial arts, that it's just dancing. Let them say it. Rosa's voice was quiet now, but it carried the weight of absolute certainty. Let them think what they want right up until the moment they learn otherwise. Valentina felt tears threatening for the first time that day. I'm scared, Vovo. Not of fighting, I'm scared of what happens after. I'm scared of becoming like them. Rosa reached across the table and took her granddaughter's small hands in her own, weathered ones. Listen to me, netinha. There's a difference between being strong and being cruel. There's a difference between defending yourself and becoming the aggressor. Your grandfather knew this, I know this, and deep down, you know this, too. The conversation haunted Valentina through the rest of the week as the harassment continued to escalate. Marcus and his crew seemed to sense her growing tension, like sharks scenting blood in the water. They began to time their encounters more carefully, catching her in places where teachers wouldn't see, where other students were less likely to witness anything too obvious. Friday morning brought the worst incident yet. Valentina had arrived early as usual, but found her locker vandalized with permanent marker. Midget Freak was scrawled across the metal in black letters, along with a crude drawing that was clearly meant to represent her. She stood staring at it for several minutes, her reflection distorted in the defaced surface. Artistic, isn't it? Marcus appeared beside her, and she realized with sinking horror that other students were beginning to arrive, their voices and laughter growing louder as they approached the scene. Jake's really been working on his drawing skills. A crowd began to gather, phones emerging as students recognized the potential for viral content. Valentina could hear the whispers, the barely contained laughter, the excited speculation about what would happen next. You know what I love about this? Ashley joined them, her voice carrying clearly in the morning air. It's not even mean, it's just accurate, right? Truth in advertising. Maybe we should add more details, Jake suggested, pulling out another marker. Really capture the full picture. Something shifted in Valentina's chest, a loosening of bonds she had carefully maintained for months. She thought of her grandmother's words, of the berimbau sitting unused in their apartment, of 12 years of training that she had locked away out of fear and shame. Don't, she said quietly. Marcus leaned closer, cupping his ear theatrically. What was that? I think the mouse squeaked. I said don't. This time her voice carried clearly, and something in its tone made several students stop their conversations and turn to look. Or what? Marcus laughed, but there was an edge to it now, a note of uncertainty that hadn't been there before. What exactly are you going to do about it, Shorty? Valentina turned away from her locker to face him fully for the first time since the harassment had begun. Her shoulders were straight, her feet positioned in a stance that looked casual but felt like coiled springs. I'm asking you nicely. Don't write on my locker anymore, and I'm telling you to make me. Marcus stepped closer, using his height advantage to loom over her. What are you going to do? Tell the principal. Tell your mummy. My grandmother, actually, Valentina said conversationally, and several students near them snickered at what they assumed was weakness. She always told me to try talking first. Jake stepped up beside Marcus, marker still in hand. Well, you tried talking. Didn't work. So now what? The hallway had grown crowded, students sensing drama and positioning themselves for the best view. Phones were recording openly now, and Valentina could see teachers beginning to move in their direction, though they were still too far away to intervene immediately. Ashley moved to Valentina's other side, effectively boxing her in against the lockers. You know what I think. I think you like the attention. I think deep down you want us to notice you because otherwise you're just invisible. You're probably right, Valentina said, her voice calm in a way that seemed to unsettle her tormentors. But I'm done being invisible now. Marcus reached out to shove her shoulder, the way he had done dozens of times before, but this time Valentina wasn't there. She had shifted her weight and position so smoothly that his hand met only air, and his momentum carried him forward into the locker with a metallic clang that echoed through the hallway. The watching students erupted in surprised laughter and scattered applause. Marcus straightened quickly, his face flushing red with embarrassment and rage. You little... He swung harder this time, a real punch aimed at her face. Valentina moved like water, her body flowing around the attack, in a motion so fluid it looked almost like dancing. Her hand came up to guide his arm past her head, while her other hand pressed against his chest, and suddenly Marcus was spinning past her to crash into Jake, both of them stumbling and nearly falling. What the hell? Jake started to say, but Valentina was already moving again, her body dropping low and spinning, one leg sweeping out in a wide arc that would have taken both boys off their feet if they hadn't scrambled backward in. Alarm. She rose from the movement like smoke, balanced on the balls of her feet, her eyes focused and alert in a way that none of them had ever seen before. The hallway had gone completely silent, except for the continued clicking of phone cameras. That's not possible, Ashley breathed, staring at the small girl who suddenly didn't seem small at all. She's like 2 feet tall. How did she... Marcus came at her again, this time with Jake beside him, both of them rushing forward with the confidence of size and numbers. Valentina's response was poetry written in motion and physics. She ducked, under Marcus's grab, her hand striking upward to catch his wrist and redirect his energy while her foot hooked behind his ankle. As he fell forward, she was already spinning away from Jake's clumsy tackle, her elbow passing inches from his nose as he overextended and crashed into the lockers where she had been standing. Marcus hit the floor hard, the breath whooshing out of his lungs. Jake bounced off the lockers and staggered backward, clutching his shoulder where it had impacted the metal. Both boys stared up at Valentina from their positions on the floor, shock and confusion replacing their previous confidence. Capoeira, said a voice from the crowd, and Valentina turned to see David Kim, a quiet senior she barely knew pushing through the other students. Holy shit, that was capoeira. Real capoeira. The word rippled through the gathered crowd like wildfire. Students who had never heard the term before were Googling it on their phones, watching videos, making connections. Those who knew what it was were staring at Valentina with new respect and not a little fear. Marcus struggled to his feet, his face a mask of humiliation and rage. "You think you're tough now? You think this changes anything?" "I think," Valentina said quietly, settling back into a ready stance that now looked unmistakably martial, "that you should probably stop while you can still walk away." But Marcus was beyond rational thought. The humiliation of being put on the floor by someone half his size in front of the entire school had pushed him past his breaking point. He came at her with real violence this time, no longer playing games or establishing dominance, but genuinely trying to hurt her. Valentina met his charge with a movement that was pure art and absolute violence combined. She dropped low and spun, her leg sweeping out in a wide arc that caught Marcus behind both knees and sent him crashing backward. As he fell, her other leg came up in a graceful arc that stopped inches from his face, close enough that he could feel the wind from her foot against his cheek. The message was unmistakable. She could have ended the fight permanently, but chose not to. Jake, seeing his friend on the ground with Valentina's foot poised near his head, made one last desperate attempt to tackle her from the side. Without even looking at him, Valentina shifted her weight and drove her elbow backward into his solar plexus with surgical precision. Jake doubled over, gasping for air, and she spun around him like a dancer, one hand on his shoulder and the other against his back, guiding him down to the floor with gentle but irresistible force. Ashley, who had been frozen in shock through the entire confrontation, finally found her voice. "This isn't over. You can't just attack people. I'm calling the police." Valentina straightened slowly, her breathing barely elevated despite the intense physical confrontation. Around her, the crowd of students stood in stunned silence, phones still recording, everyone trying to process what they had just witnessed. "Actually," came a calm voice from behind the crowd, "I think it is over." Principal Hendricks pushed through the students, followed by 2 security guards and several teachers who had finally arrived on the scene. His expression was stern but not unsympathetic as he surveyed the situation. 2 boys on the floor looking dazed and defeated, one girl standing calmly in the center of it all, and a defaced locker that told a clear story of harassment. "Miss Kane," he addressed Ashley directly, "I believe you mentioned calling the police. Excellent idea. I'll make sure they see all the video footage from our security cameras, as well as what I'm sure are dozens of phone recordings from today. I think they'll be very interested in the pattern of harassment that led to this defensive action." Ashley's face went pale as the implications sank in. Around them, students began to mutter and shift uncomfortably, many of them realizing they had recorded evidence of sustained bullying rather than the unprovoked attack they had expected to see. Marcus struggled to his feet, his pride as bruised as his body. "She attacked us. You all saw it." "What I saw," said David Kim, stepping forward with his phone still recording, "was you trying to hit her first, multiple times, after weeks of harassment that everyone in this school has witnessed." Other voices began to join in, students who had previously been silent finding their courage now that the balance of power had shifted so dramatically. Stories poured out about the daily humiliations, the destroyed property, the systematic campaign to make Valentina's life miserable. Teachers looked increasingly uncomfortable as they realized how much they had ignored or dismissed. "Miss Restrepo," Principal Hendricks said formally, "please gather your belongings from your locker. I think we need to have a conversation in my office about arranging for a replacement locker and discussing some policy changes regarding harassment in our hallways." As Valentina knelt to collect the books and papers that had fallen during the confrontation, she felt a dozen hands reaching out to help her. Students who had walked past her spilled belongings for months were suddenly eager to assist, to be associated with someone who had revealed such unexpected strength and grace under pressure. Marcus and Jake were escorted to the nurse's office first, then to face their own meetings with administration and parents. Ashley followed shortly after, her earlier bravado replaced by the dawning realization that her social status couldn't protect her from the consequences of documented harassment. The hallway began to empty as students reluctantly headed to their first period classes, but the energy had changed completely. Conversations buzzed with excitement and disbelief, and Valentina's name was on everyone's lips for the first time since she had arrived at Riverside Prep. "Miss Restrepo," Principal Hendricks said as she finished gathering her belongings, "I owe you an apology. It's clear that our staff has failed to address a serious situation, and I take full responsibility for that oversight." Valentina nodded but didn't speak. She was still processing the events of the last 10 minutes, still adjusting to the way other students were looking at her now, with respect instead of dismissal, with curiosity instead of contempt. The rest of the day passed in a surreal blur. In every class, students who had never spoken to her before found excuses to start conversations. Teachers who had previously overlooked her suddenly seemed to remember her name and make eye contact when she raised her hand. The cafeteria, which had been a daily gauntlet of humiliation, became a place where multiple tables called out invitations for her to join them. But perhaps the most significant change was in herself. Valentina walked differently now, her shoulders straight and her head up. She made eye contact instead of staring at the floor. When she spoke, her voice carried the quiet confidence of someone who had been tested and had not been found wanting. After school, she found herself standing in front of her grandmother's restaurant, staring at her reflection in the window. Rosa appeared beside her, wiping her hands on her apron. "So," her grandmother said conversationally, "I heard you had an interesting day at school." Valentina turned to look at her, unsurprised that the news had already reached her. In their small community, word traveled fast, especially news this dramatic. "I did what you said, Vovo. I remembered who I am." Rosa studied her granddaughter's face, noting the straight spine and clear eyes that replaced the hunched shoulders and downcast gaze of recent months. "And how does it feel?" "Scary," Valentina admitted, "but good, really good." "And the boys, who were bothering you?" "They won't be bothering anyone for a while. Principal Hendricks suspended them for 2 weeks, and their parents are looking at charges for harassment and assault." Valentina paused, thinking about the conversation she'd had with the principal. He also asked if I'd be interested in starting a capoeira club at school. Apparently, several students have already expressed interest in learning. Rosa smiled, the expression transforming her weathered face. "Your grandfather would be proud. He always said the best fights are the ones that end with teaching instead of just winning." That evening, Valentina sat in her room working on homework, but her mind kept drifting to the events of the day. She thought about Marcus and Jake, both facing consequences they had never imagined. She thought about Ashley, whose carefully constructed social hierarchy had crumbled in a matter of minutes. But mostly, she thought about the moment when she had stopped being afraid and started being herself. A knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in." Rosa entered, carrying a tray with 2 cups of tea and a plate of her famous brigadeiros. She set it on the desk and took a seat on the bed, studying her granddaughter with proud eyes. "I have something for you," she said, reaching into her pocket and withdrawing a small cloth bag. "It belonged to your grandfather and before him to his master in Salvador." Valentina opened the bag carefully and gasped. Inside was a berimbau bow made of dark wood, worn smooth by decades of use, inlaid with small pieces of silver that caught the light like stars. "He would have wanted you to have it," Rosa said simply, "now that you remember who you are." The following Monday, Valentina walked into Riverside Prep with her head high and the berimbau case slung across her shoulder. The hallways parted before her like water, not from fear, but from respect. Students nodded as she passed, and several approached to ask about the capoeira club that was already generating excitement throughout the school. Her new locker, relocated to a more central location after Principal Hendricks's personal intervention, was decorated with flowers and notes of support from students she had never met. The custodial staff had made sure it gleamed, and security cameras had been strategically repositioned to monitor the area more effectively. During lunch, she sat with a diverse group of students who had gravitated toward her natural grace and quiet strength. The conversation flowed easily, touching on everything from martial arts to music to the social dynamics that had been exposed and disrupted by recent events. Marcus returned from his suspension a different person, subdued and avoiding eye contact with everyone. Jake followed his lead, and both boys seemed to have developed a healthy respect for personal space and appropriate behavior. Ashley's return was even more dramatic. Her previous circle of sycophants had largely abandoned her, and she found herself eating lunch alone at a corner table, experiencing for the first time the isolation she had helped inflict on others. The Capoeira Club's first meeting drew nearly 30 students, far exceeding everyone's expectations. Valentina found herself in the unfamiliar role of teacher and leader, guiding curious classmates through basic movements and the philosophy behind the art. David Kim proved to be a natural student, and several younger classmen showed real aptitude for the flowing combinations of dance and combat. The most important thing to understand, Valentina explained as the group formed a circle in the gymnasium, is that capoeira isn't about fighting. It's about expression, about community, about being ready for whatever comes while never looking for trouble. She demonstrated a basic ginga, the fundamental movement that formed the foundation of everything else. It looks simple, but it's actually teaching you to be balanced, to be ready to move in any direction, to never be where your opponent expects you to be. As the weeks passed, the club grew and evolved. Students who had never spoken to each other found common ground in the shared challenge of learning something completely new. The rhythm of the berimbau became a familiar sound in the halls of Riverside Prep, and the philosophy of capoeira began to influence the school's culture in subtle but important ways. Principal Hendricks, initially concerned about liability issues with a martial arts program, became one of the club's strongest supporters after witnessing how it brought together students from different social circles and backgrounds. The anti-bullying presentations that had been mandatory but ineffective for years were supplemented with practical workshops on conflict resolution and self-respect that drew directly from capoeira's emphasis on community and mutual respect. Valentina's transformation was perhaps the most remarkable of all. The quiet, invisible girl who had spent months enduring harassment had become a confident young woman who moved through the world with grace and purpose. She still studied hard and kept largely to herself, but now it was by choice rather than necessity. When she spoke, people listened. When she moved, they watched with appreciation rather than mockery. The incident that had started it all became part of school legend, retold and embellished with each telling. But the real story wasn't about the moment of physical confrontation. It was about the quiet revolution that followed. The way one person's refusal to remain powerless had changed the entire ecosystem of their environment. On a warm Friday afternoon in late spring, Valentina stood in the center of the gymnasium, surrounded by her capoeira students, the berimbau's rhythm filling the space as pairs of students flowed through their practiced movements. She watched with pride as shy freshmen found their confidence, as former adversaries learned to respect each other's space and dignity, as the ancient art her grandfather had carried from Brazil continued to evolve and adapt in this new environment. Marcus appeared in the doorway, hesitating as if unsure whether he was welcome. Valentina caught his eye and nodded toward the circle, an invitation rather than a challenge. He entered slowly, his movements uncertain but respectful. "I wanted to apologize," he said quietly when the music paused, "not just for that day, but for everything."